I'm going to tell you something that sounds impossible. I know it sounds impossible. I was there. I lived it. And there are still mornings on this rock where I wake up and I have to remind myself that it actually happened. That a single human being walked through the intake gates of Penal Colony Facility 9 in Sector 07, and within 14 standard galactic months, was co-hosting movie night with the Warden. Not metaphorically. Not as a joke. Literally, every third rotation cycle, Warden Morithgal, a 7-foot Kethvari with horns that could punch through reinforced hull plating, would set up a projection screen in the East Recreation Yard, and he and the human would sit in matching chairs and watch movies. Old Earth movies. Movies that none of us understood and most of us were too afraid to admit we didn't understand. And Gal would lean over and ask questions in that low, grinding voice of his, and the human would explain, and Gal would nod slowly, and sometimes, the human would laugh at something, and we would all be so grateful that it wasn't directed at us. My name is Vekrath. I'm a former inmate of Facility 9. I was in for 6 standard years on an arms trafficking conviction, and I served every single rotation of it. And when people ask me what the worst part was, I don't say the food. I don't say the guards. I don't say the isolation or the recycled air, or the fact that the only entertainment we had before the human arrived was a broken holographic chess set with 3 missing pieces. I say, watching Corin Masson arrive, and realizing that nothing was ever going to be the same. You have to understand what Facility 9 was. Sector 07 sits at the absolute edge of habitable space, and I do mean edge. The station orbits a dim red giant that barely qualifies as a star. The gravity plating inside runs at about 1.4 standard galactic units, which makes movement exhausting for most species. The recycled air carries a constant faint smell of sulfur because of the mineral deposits in the asteroid field the station was anchored to. The temperature in most of the cell blocks never got above 12 degrees Celsius, and the heating systems failed twice a year like clockwork. The Galactic Interspecies Penal Commission had designated Facility 9 as a maximum security holding site for what they called high-threat, cross-jurisdictional offenders. What that actually meant, in practical terms, was that they sent everyone there that no other facility wanted. The violent ones. The ones who had escaped other prisons. The ones who were so politically complicated that keeping them anywhere with better conditions would cause diplomatic incidents. Facility 9 was the place where the galaxy put things it didn't want to look at. It had a population of approximately 900 inmates when Masson arrived. The species breakdown was, let me try to remember this from the intake rosters I saw once, years later, after everything. Something like 40% Kethvari, 20% Vralian, 15% Sorathi, and then a scattered collection of Dren, Mulvathi, Hessborn, and assorted others. The guards were almost exclusively Gal's people, the Kethvari, because they were the only species the Commission had been able to find that could physically manage the population without suffering catastrophic injury rates. And then, on a standard transport that arrived with no prior announcement, and a manifest that had been deliberately vague about its contents, they delivered one human. Corin Masson, 31 years old by Earth reckoning. Former soldier, former colonial security contractor, 6 years raised on Kepler 442b, which the galactic community had designated, with characteristic understatement, as a Class 7 Deathworld. Which meant hostile atmospheric chemistry in the lower elevations, predator fauna capable of taking down Kethvari in open combat, gravitational variants that could snap bones at the wrong altitude, and weather systems that made the most violent storms in galactic recorded history look like mild inconveniences. He had been convicted of something. I never fully understood the charges. The politics around them were complicated in a way that involved 3 different jurisdictions, and a treaty dispute that I still don't entirely follow. But the conviction had been real, and the sentence had been 6 standard years, and someone in the Commission's prisoner placement division had looked at a Class 7 Deathworlder with a military background and a history of violence and thought, yes, Facility 9, that seems proportionate. What they had not thought about was what Facility 9 would make of him. I was in the intake processing yard when he arrived. A group of us were being rotated from one cell block to another, a standard quarterly shuffle the administration did to prevent the formation of what they called territorial stability networks, which was their bureaucratic way of saying gangs. So I was standing in a loose line of about 30 inmates, all waiting to be processed and reassigned, when the transport docked and the guards brought the new arrival through. There were 3 Kethvari guards with him, standard intake escort. Each one of them was carrying a restraint baton and a secondary immobilizer, and they were walking in the tight formation they used for what they classified as high-risk transfers. The human walking between them was about, I want to say 5'11". I don't have the best intuition for human height. He was shorter than the Kethvari, which is not saying much because everyone is shorter than the Kethvari. He was wearing standard-issue transfer clothing, the gray kind with no markings, and his wrists were in the magnetic restraint cuffs that the Commission used for inmates they considered escape risks. His hair was dark and cut close to his head. He had a scar that ran from just below his left ear down to his jaw, and another one on the back of his right hand that disappeared under the restraint cuff. He was looking around. That's the thing I remember most clearly. Most new arrivals come through that intake yard with their eyes down. You learn, very quickly, that making eye contact with the wrong person in a place like Facility 9 can accelerate your introduction to the social hierarchy in ways you don't want. So most people come in looking at the floor, or at the guards, or at some neutral middle distance that says, I am not a threat and I am not a target, please leave me alone. Masson came through looking at everything. Not in the way that scared people look at everything, that frantic, jerky scanning of someone trying to identify all possible threats simultaneously. He was looking at things the way someone looks at a new city when they've just arrived, and they're genuinely curious about what they're going to find. Slow, methodical. His eyes moved across the yard in sections, taking in the cell block architecture, the guard positions, the other inmates, the recycled air vents, the overhead lighting grid, the maintenance corridors. Like he was filing things away. Like he was building a map. He looked at me just for a moment, then his eyes moved on. I exhaled. I hadn't realized I'd been holding my breath. The first incident happened within 4 hours of his arrival. I heard about it secondhand from a Vralian named Sket who had been in the adjacent cell block. Sket was in for piracy and had been at Facility 9 for 2 years, which meant he knew things. He came to me at the evening meal distribution and said, very quietly, the new human had a conversation with the Block C intake crew. Now, the Block C intake crew was a group of 7 Kethvari inmates who had established themselves as the dominant social force in that particular section of the facility. They had a simple methodology. New arrivals came in, the intake crew explained the social structure. New arrivals contributed resources, food rations, labor credits, information, and in exchange the intake crew left them alone. It was not elegant, but it was functional, and the guards tolerated it because it reduced the overall rate of spontaneous violence. How did that go? I asked Sket. Sket was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the crew leader Vorgax, he approached the human in the cell block corridor. Standard approach. You know how Vorgax does it. I knew how Vorgax did it. Vorgax was enormous even by Kethvari standards, and he had a way of filling a corridor that made it very clear he wasn't moving for you. And I said. The human looked up at him, Sket said. Just looked up. You know how the new ones usually react, they back up, They show their throat. Some of them try to run, which never goes well. Sket paused. The human looked up at him and said, and I'm translating here because I only have intermediate standard galactic, the human said. You're the welcome committee. I've had worse. What do you actually want? I stared at Sket. Vorgax explained the system, Sket continued. The contributions, the protection arrangement, the hierarchy. And the human said. The human said he'd heard about arrangements like that. Said he'd been in situations like that before. Said he was happy to work within an existing structure if the structure was actually functional, and not just a way for the people at the top to take things from the people at the bottom without providing anything real in return. Sket paused again. Then he asked Vorgax what exactly the crew was providing. What did Vorgax say? Vorgax said, protection from other inmates. And the human said. Sket looked at me with an expression I didn't entirely know how to read at the time. The human said, from who? You're the most dangerous things in this block. You don't have external threats. You are the external threat. So what you're actually describing is protection money. And protection money only works if the person paying it is more afraid of you than you are of them. So, and I need you to understand, I watched this happen. He just looked at Vorgax. Just looked at him for about 15 seconds without blinking. And then, I said. And then Vorgax said he'd think about it, Sket said, and he left. I sat with that for a moment. Vorgax left, I said. He said he'd think about it, Sket confirmed. And then he walked away. And the human went to his cell and apparently spent the next 2 hours doing exercises I've never seen anything do in a standard cell gravity environment. I looked at my meal ration. I looked at Sket. This is going to be interesting, I said. It's going to be something, Sket agreed. The second incident was 3 days later, and I was there for this one. Facility 9 had a recreation yard. One large central space used for physical exercise, informal social time, and the occasional mediated dispute. The yard was under constant surveillance, which meant that overtly violent incidents were rare, but the guards had a policy of not intervening in what they classified as non-lethal social dynamics, which was their way of saying, if someone is being intimidated or pushed around but nobody is actually bleeding, we're going to watch and log it and not step in. Masson was in the yard. He had found a section of the perimeter wall that had a specific surface texture, something about the construction material that provided grip, I think, and he was doing something with it that I had no category for. He was running up it, not climbing it. Running up it. He would take a short approach, hit the wall at speed, and run vertically for about 4 steps before catching himself and dropping back down. Then he'd do it again. He was apparently working on increasing the number of steps he could take before gravity reasserted itself. He'd been at it for about 20 minutes when 3 of the Sorathi inmates decided to make an impression. The Sorathi are, I should explain this because not everyone reading this will know their biology. The Sorathi are a species that evolved in high-pressure, high-gravity environments, and they have a secondary musculature that runs along their back and flanks that is primarily defensive. When they expand it, they look significantly larger than they actually are. It's a threat display. It works on most species because the visual impression of a Sorathi at full expansion is quite alarming. The 3 of them approached Masson while he was in the middle of one of his wall-running attempts. He dropped back down, turned around, and looked at them. Human, said the lead Sorathi. Her name, I learned later, was Thresh. She had been at Facility 9 for 4 years and had a reputation. You're occupying Sorathi space. Masson looked at the section of wall he'd been using. Then he looked at the rest of the yard. Then he looked at Thresh. This wall, he said. This section, Thresh said, and she and the 2 others expanded their display musculature, fully, all 3 of them. It was, objectively speaking, quite impressive. Even I felt a reflexive urge to step back, and I'd seen Sorathi displays many times. Masson tilted his head. He looked at the three of them. He looked at the expanded musculature. And then, I will never forget this for as long as I live, he said, with what I can only describe as genuine academic curiosity. Can you hold that for long? Sustained muscle expansion like that must be metabolically expensive in this gravity and temperature environment. Does it cause fatigue? Thresh blinked. What? The expansion, Masson said, gesturing at her secondary musculature. I'm asking how long you can maintain it. I've never seen Sorathi threat display up close before. I've read about it, but the visual is really something. The musculature integration must be remarkable. The three Sorathi looked at each other. We are claiming this space, Thresh said, but some of the certainty had gone out of her voice. That's fine, Masson said, with a kind of casual reasonableness that I think confused everyone in the yard, including me. I'll find another section of wall. I just need a surface with enough texture for grip at this speed. The smooth sections don't work. He paused. Actually, does anyone know which areas of the perimeter have the highest friction coefficient? It would save me testing time. Complete silence in the yard. Thresh slowly let her display musculature relax. The northeast corner, she said, finally, in a voice that sounded like she didn't entirely understand why she was answering. The construction crew that built that section used a different composite. It's rougher. Perfect, Masson said. Thank you, I mean that. And he walked to the northeast corner. And the three Sorathi stood where they were for a long moment. And then Thresh said something in the Sorathi dialect that I don't speak well enough to translate exactly, but the Sorathi inmate standing next to me later told me it roughly meant. I don't know what just happened. The third incident was the one that reached the guard's log. 8 days in. There's a section of Facility 9 called the Maintenance Corridor, a long service passage that runs between two cell blocks and contains the ventilation regulation systems and the nutrient fluid pipeline for the automated meal dispensers. It's technically off-limits to inmates, but the panel that restricts access had been broken for about 9 months and nobody had fixed it, so certain inmates used it as a transit corridor and a meeting space because the surveillance was minimal in that section. A Vralian named Kruskad, 8-year veteran of the facility, not the kind of person you wanted to meet in an unsupervised space, had apparently decided that the human needed a more direct education than the one Vorgax and Thresh had attempted to provide. Kruskad was not interested in conversation or intimidation dynamics. Kruskad was interested in the establishment of clear physical hierarchy, because, in his experience, that was the most efficient and durable form of social organization. He went into the maintenance corridor after Masson. 2 guards were monitoring the corridor entrance from a distance. Facility 9 had very few interior cameras in the maintenance sections, and what happened was reconstructed from their external observations and from what they found when they opened the service panel 12 minutes later. What they found was Kruskad on the floor, not badly injured but not entirely functional, and Masson sitting on a piece of ventilation machinery eating a ration bar. The guard's report, which I read later when someone got access to the administrative archive, says the following. Inmate H001, Masson, C., was found sitting calmly in the maintenance corridor. Inmate Kruskad was found in an incapacitated position, respiratory function normal, no critical injury, but expressing significant disorientation. When asked what had occurred, inmate H001 stated that there had been a brief disagreement about navigation and that it had been resolved. When pressed for clarification, inmate H001 said that Kruskad had slipped. When informed that the guard log did not indicate any environmental hazard that would cause a slip, inmate H001 said he was pretty sure Kruskad had slipped. Inmate H001 was returned to his cell block without further incident. He asked if there was any way to get an additional blanket because his cell was running cold. That last part, that was the part that everyone circulated. The guards, the inmates, everyone. He just put Krusket on the floor and then asked for a blanket. Not aggressively, not as a power move, genuinely asked, like he was cold and wanted a blanket, and that was the most pressing thing on his mind. Facility 9 has a black market system for additional blankets. It is the most universally understood unit of comfort currency in the entire facility. You ask a guard for a blanket and you're announcing a need. Kruskat's crew had been controlling blanket distribution in the Block C corridor for 2 years. 3 days after the maintenance corridor incident, Kruskat sent a message via inmate communication. The informal system, not the official one, asking Masson if he wanted to have a meal together. Part 2. The question of what he was. I should explain something about how Facility 9 worked, socially. In most galactic penal systems, the inmate hierarchy is species-based first, threat assessment-based second. You slot in based on where your species falls on the general power scale, and then you adjust based on individual demonstration. It's not a perfect system, but it's predictable, and predictability is something inmates value above almost everything else. What Masson represented was a category failure. Humans had been known to the galactic community for about 60 standard years at the point when he arrived. 60 years is not a long time in galactic terms. Humans were still in what the broader community called the integration period, that uncertain early phase where a new species is present, acknowledged, and not entirely trusted. The galactic community had a rough sense of human capabilities, but the understanding was shallow and often filtered through diplomatic or commercial contexts. Nobody had really seen what a human could do in an environment like Facility 9, under the specific pressures that environment created. The species power ranking that the Facility 9 inmate population had been operating by placed Kithvari at the top, Sorathi second, Vralian third, and then everyone else in descending order. Humans were not on the list at all. They hadn't been a significant enough presence in the broader galactic criminal ecosystem to have earned a placement. So when Masson arrived, nobody knew where to put him. He was shorter than a Kithvari. He was less physically imposing than a Vralian in their display state. He had no visible biological weaponry, no secondary musculature, no venom glands, no natural armor plating. He was, by external appearance, unimpressive. And then he started doing things that didn't fit any category. The wall running, the maintenance corridor incident, the way he talked to Vorgex, the calm, systematic observation of his environment, the questions he asked that somehow ended up moving conversations in directions people hadn't planned for. An inmate named Goth, a Dren, in for financial crimes, one of the more analytical minds in the facility, spent about 3 weeks watching Masson before he came to me with a theory. I think, Goth said, very carefully, that the problem is we're evaluating him by the wrong metrics. What do you mean? I said. We're looking at his physical presentation and comparing it to Kithvari, Sorathi, Vralian, and by those metrics he's medium at best. But I don't think that's the right comparison. I think we need to think about what environment produced him and work backward. He's from a Deathworld, I said. Class 7, Goth said, which means the life forms on his origin planet evolved in direct competition with one of the most hostile environments in the catalogued galaxy. You know what distinguishes Class 7 Deathworld fauna from everything else? It's not size. It's not primary physical capability. It's adaptability, behavior modification under pressure, the ability to assess a new environment and modify threat response in real time. Goth paused. He is not performing here. He is not trying to seem dangerous. He is actually assessing this place and adapting to it, and the reason it's unnerving is that we can all sense it even if we can't articulate it. So what does that mean practically? I said. It means, Goth said, That we should probably not test him further until we understand what the ceiling of his adaptation is. Because every time someone has tested him so far, they've come out of it less certain about where that ceiling is. And that uncertainty is more dangerous than any specific physical capability. I thought about Krusgad sitting on the floor of the maintenance corridor, with a look of profound confusion on his face. That is possibly the most useful observation anyone has made since he arrived, I said. Goth nodded. I'm planning to introduce myself to him tomorrow. Is that wise? It is, Goth said, if the goal is to understand before the next incident happens rather than after. Goth's assessment of Masson's adaptation was correct, but it was missing one component. The component nobody had thought about was, he was also bored. I know that sounds strange. Facility 9 was not, by any standard measure, a boring environment. It was loud, unpredictable, occasionally violent, and densely populated with 900 entities from across the galaxy who had been placed there specifically, because they represented challenges to galactic social order. But Masson had grown up on Kepler 442b. He had spent 6 years of his childhood learning to navigate an environment where the wrong canyon at the wrong altitude would depressurize his suit, where the megafauna in the lower forests were large enough to overturn a personal transport vehicle, where the weather systems could drop visibility to 0 and temperature to lethal within 20 minutes. Compared to that, Facility 9 was predictable. He'd mapped the social hierarchy within a week. He'd identified the key power nodes, the resource control points, the communication networks, the guard rotation schedules. He'd located the structural weak points in the facility's physical infrastructure, not because he was planning an escape, he told Goth later, but because understanding the structural weak points of any enclosed space was a survival reflex he couldn't turn off. He was physically comfortable. The gravity at 1.4 standard units was challenging for most species, but Kepler 442b ran at 1.6 standard in the settled regions and much higher in the deeper surface zones. The cold temperature that made most inmates miserable was, for him, bracing rather than punishing. The sulfur smell in the recycled air was unpleasant but not physiologically significant. He had exhausted his initial adaptation tasks and had nothing to do. This is when he started talking to people. Goth introduced himself in the recreation yard on the 9th or 10th day. Masson apparently received this with what Goth described as genuine warmth, which was unexpected and slightly disorienting. They talked for about an hour. Goth came back to our cell block that evening looking thoughtful. Well, I said. He's from a military background, Goth said. Special operations category, though he was vague about the specifics. 6 years on Kepler 442b as a child, then a decade and a half in various military and security contractor roles. He's been in 4 different prisons across 3 jurisdictions before this one. Facility 9 is his 5th prison. 5th. And he says it's the most comfortable one he's been in. I stared at Goth. He said it's comfortable. He said the gravity is lighter than what he's used to. The temperature regulation is consistent even if cold. The inmate population is large enough to provide social variety, and the food, while medically optimized and probably designed by someone who has never eaten, is at least reliably provided. Goth paused. He also said he thinks the guard-to-inmate ratio is inefficient, and that the administrative approach to conflict management is reactive rather than preventive, which he considers a structural flaw. He's critiquing the prison administration. He's critiquing it the way someone critiques a logistics system they've been asked to improve. Goth frowned. He has opinions about the ventilation schedule. He thinks the cell block layout creates unnecessary social pressure points that cause violence that could be avoided with different traffic flow management. He's been here 2 weeks, and he's redesigning the facility layout in his head. He has also, Goth said, read every piece of written material available in the General Access Archive, which, as you know, is not a large collection, but it took him about 4 days. I sat down. He's bored. He is profoundly, deeply bored, Goth confirmed, and he has begun asking the guards if there is any way to access more reading material. He specifically asked about Earth Media Archives. And the guards said they'd look into it. Guards at Facility 9 don't look into things, I said. No, Goth agreed, they don't, usually. The guard who responded to Masson's request about Earth Media Archives was a Kithvari named Torvin. Torvin was not a typical Facility 9 guard. Most of the Kithvari staff had a specific professional profile, military background, high tolerance for stress, limited interest in anything outside their assigned function. They did their job, they logged their reports, they went to the staff quarters on the other side of the facility, and presumably had rich interior lives that nobody in the inmate population ever saw. Torvin was different in a way that was hard to articulate. He had been at Facility 9 for 8 years, longer than most of the guards, and he had developed what I can only call an anthropological curiosity about the inmate population. He watched people. He asked questions, not interrogative questions, but the kind of questions someone asks because they're genuinely interested. He had a habit of lingering near conversations in the yard when he was supposed to be doing perimeter checks, not because he was monitoring for violations, but because he was listening. He was also, as it turned out, the guard who managed the facility's administrative archive access systems. When Masson's request came through the formal channel, guards were required to log all inmate requests, even informal ones. Torvin saw it and flagged it for follow-up. He went to Masson's cell on the 14th day. You asked about Earth Media Archives, Torvin said, according to Masson's later account. What specifically were you looking for? Movies, Masson said. Torvin apparently repeated this word as though testing it. Movies. Yeah, film. Visual narrative media. Earth has been producing it for about 200 years before we had any galactic contact. I haven't seen any in a couple of years and I'd like to watch something. He paused. It's a specific kind of comfort. I realize that's a strange thing to ask for. Torvin was quiet for a moment. I have accessed Earth Visual Media Archives through my administrative credentials before, Torvin said. For documentation purposes. Classification of cultural artifacts for processing. For what? The Commission requires that any cultural media carried by incoming inmates be catalogued. Some of your fellow humans have come through other facilities. Torvin paused. I've watched some of it, for cataloging purposes. Another pause. What did you think? Masson asked. Torvin was quiet for a long time, long enough that Masson thought the conversation was over. Then Torvin said, I didn't understand most of it, but I watched a great deal of it. Part 3, the movie. The first screening happened on day 22. I need to be precise about what first screening means, because there was a long period before the official movie night where things happened on a smaller scale. Torvin brought a portable projection unit to Masson's cell. This was, technically, an unauthorized use of administrative equipment, but Torvin had enough seniority that nobody questioned what he did with the archive access systems, and they watched something. Masson told Goth about it the next day, and Goth told me, and the story spread through the cell blocks the way everything spread through Facility 9. Quickly, imprecisely, and with several layers of embellishment that I've tried to strip away in this account. What I know is that Torvin brought the equipment, they watched an Earth film, and at some point Torvin asked a question about what was happening on screen. Masson explained. Torvin asked another question. Masson explained again. And then, apparently, they kept watching. The film was called something. I didn't learn the title until much later. It was one of the old action films from about 100 years ago, Masson said. Humans running through burning buildings, explosions, a man jumping between buildings and somehow surviving. He asked, Masson said to Goth, whether the physics were accurate. What did you say? Goth asked. I said no, definitely not. Nobody could survive that fall realistically. And Torvin looked at me very seriously and said, then why does the story work? Why did I keep watching if I knew the physics were not real? Masson paused. And we spent about 2 hours talking about suspension of disbelief and narrative tension, and why humans make stories where the physics are wrong on purpose. Goth brought this conversation to me. I thought about it for a while. Then I said, I want to watch one. You want to? An Earth film. I want to see what they're talking about. Goth considered this. We'd have to ask Masson. I know. And Torvin. I know. 3 days later, there were 6 of us in Masson's cell. Masson, Torvin, Goth, me, Sket, and a dren named Palav who had heard about it and asked to join. We watched something Masson called a comedy. I did not understand most of the jokes, but I laughed twice, which surprised me, and I'm still not entirely sure why. After it ended, Masson looked at all of us and said, what did you think? And we all sat there for a moment, and then Sket said, very quietly, I want to watch another one. That was the beginning. It grew slowly, then quickly. Word moved through Facility 9 in the way that only truly interesting things move, not loudly, not through official channels, but through the specific kind of quiet enthusiasm that travels faster than sound. People were watching Earth films in Masson's cell. People were talking about them afterward. The conversations that came out of these screenings were not, as I can attest from personal experience, the kinds of conversations that normally happened in a maximum security penal colony. We were talking about things like, what does it mean to be brave? The film we watched in the 3rd session was about a human running into a disaster, a building collapse, I think, to save strangers, and there was a long conversation afterward about whether that was a human thing specifically or whether it was a general feature of evolved intelligence. The Vralian inmates who had heard about the sessions wanted to know if all Earth stories were about this, about creatures sacrificing themselves for others. A lot of them are, Masson said. Not all, but a lot. Why? Asked a Vralian named Sketh, not the same Sket who was my contact, a different one. Masson thought about it. Because we spent a very long time, he said, being eaten. And the ones who made it through were the ones who figured out that if you run toward the thing that's eating you instead of away from it, if you put yourself between the threat and the group, you give everyone else a chance. The cell was very quiet. You evolved that, Sketh said. We didn't choose it, Masson said. It just happened. The ones who hid survived individually, but the groups didn't last. The ones who ran toward the groups survived. The individuals sometimes didn't, but the groups did. He paused. So eventually you get a whole species full of people who think running toward the problem is just the thing you do. Another quiet moment. That explains, said Goth slowly, quite a lot about you specifically. Does it? Masson said. The maintenance corridor, Goth said. Kruskad was a threat. You ran toward it. Masson looked like he hadn't thought about it that way before. I guess I did, he said. The sessions grew from 6 to 12, from 12 to 20. They started happening not just in Masson's cell, but in the larger recreation spaces during off hours, when Torvin could arrange access to the central projection systems under the cover of archive maintenance. The guard understood, on some level, that he was doing something unauthorized. But the unofficial nature of it was part of why it worked. If it had gone through official channels, it would have been classified and approved and scheduled and made bureaucratic, and some of the meaning would have leached out of it. The Sorathi inmates started attending. Thresh, the one who had done the display in the yard, came on the 6th session. She sat at the back and watched and said nothing, but she came back the next time and the time after that. The Kethvari inmates were slower to join. There was a sense among them that this was something happening below their social level, a Kethvari concern with status that made participation feel like a concession. But Vorgax came eventually. He came on what I think was the 9th or 10th session, sat in the very back, and watched an Earth film about a group of humans fighting against something much larger than themselves. At the end, he said nothing and left. He was there again the next time, and the time after that. And on the 12th session, he sat near the front. The sessions reached Warden Gall on day 67. I was not in the room when it happened, but multiple people were, and the accounts are consistent enough that I'm reasonably confident in the reconstruction. Warden Morith Gall was, as I mentioned, a 7-foot Kethvari. He had been the administrative head of Facility 9 for 11 standard years, which was a remarkably long tenure for a penal colony warden, and was generally attributed to the fact that he was both genuinely effective at his job and personally terrifying enough that nobody in the Commission's Oversight Division wanted to have a difficult conversation with him about performance metrics. He had heard about the informal film sessions through Torvin, because Torvin, to his credit, had eventually disclosed the situation to the warden rather than waiting for it to be discovered. And his initial response, according to Torvin, was to sit in silence for approximately 45 seconds before saying, "Show me." Torvin showed him. They apparently watched about 20 minutes of something. I've heard different accounts of which film it was, and then Gall said, "The human who organized this." Inmate Masson, Torvin said. He initiated the request for archive access. The screenings developed organically from there. He's a Class 7 Deathworlder, Gall said. Yes. And he's been here for 67 days, and his primary activity has been watching Earth visual media with other inmates and discussing. Gall apparently checked the log Torvin had kept. Philosophy, narrative structure, evolutionary biology, and the concept of courage. That's an accurate summary, Torvin said. Gall was quiet again for a long moment. I want to meet him, Gall said. The meeting between Gall and Masson happened in the warden's administrative office, a room that most inmates never saw the inside of except under circumstances that were unpleasant for everyone involved. Gall's account, which he recorded in his personal journal, a document I'll reference throughout this record, describes the meeting as follows. The human Masson came in and sat down without being invited to sit, which is either a cultural convention or a statement I chose to interpret as the former. He is smaller than I expected. He looks at things the way the predator fauna of high-gravity worlds look at things, comprehensive, patient, calibrating. He is not afraid of this room or of me, and he is not performing the absence of fear the way some inmates do to compensate. He is simply not afraid, the way a creature from a genuinely hostile environment is not afraid of a controlled facility. I asked him about the film sessions. He explained without defensiveness or apology, which I found refreshing. I asked him what the purpose was. He said, I was bored, and then it turned out other people were bored too, and then it turned out that watching something together and talking about it afterward was useful for everyone. I asked him to define useful. He said, people are less afraid of each other, and fear is where most of the violence comes from in a place like this. I sat with that for a moment. He is not wrong. Gall's journal continues with entries about subsequent conversations with Masson, meetings that apparently became a recurring feature of those early months, happening informally, outside scheduled administrative interactions, in the warden's office over the Kethvari equivalent of a shared meal. One entry, which I find particularly striking. He asked me tonight why I became a prison warden. I don't remember the last time anyone asked me that. I told him, because the alternative to a place like this is something worse. He asked what that meant. I explained the history of the Kethvari penal system, The previous approach, before the Commission standardized protocols, which involved classification-based termination for certain offense categories. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "So you run this place because the species that are inside it are still alive and that matters to you?" I said yes. He said, "Then we want the same thing." I'm not sure what to make of that. Part 4, Movie Night Official. The formalization of movie night happened at the end of the 4th month. Gall authorized it through an administrative mechanism that, as far as I can tell, had never been used before at Facility 9. He classified it as a cross-species cultural exchange program, which gave it standing in the facility's official activity log and allocated legitimate resources, projection equipment, access to the archive, a scheduled time block in the East Recreation Yard, without requiring Commission approval. The first official movie night attracted 240 inmates. 240 out of a population of approximately 900, which doesn't sound like most, but remember, this was the first official event that had happened at Facility 9 that was not mandatory, not punitive, and not directed by administration. This was something people chose to attend. Masson set up the projection screen with Torvin. He had specific ideas about placement, something about the angle of the ambient lighting from the overhead grid creating glare at certain positions, and spent about an hour fine-tuning before he was satisfied. He had made a selection. He'd thought about it carefully, apparently, in the weeks between when Gall approved the program and the first official screening. He chose something that, he told me later, he thought would work for a crowd with no shared cultural context. It was an Earth film from approximately 130 years before the present. It involved a small group of humans traveling across a hostile environment against significant odds, losing people along the way, making terrible mistakes, and continuing anyway. There were almost no scenes that required cultural context to interpret. The emotions, grief, determination, fear, the specific particular relief of an unexpected moment of beauty in the middle of something terrible, were universal enough to translate even without language dubbing, and Masson had worked with Goth on a real-time subtitling system that could display in the 3 most common scripts in the inmate population simultaneously. 240 people sat in the East Recreation Yard of Facility 9 in silence for 2 hours and 17 minutes, and watched something made by humans on a planet most of them had never visited and probably never would. I was there. I remember the cold of the yard and the slight sulfur smell of the recycled air, and the light from the projection screen throwing blue and gold shadows across the faces of 900 entities from across the galaxy who had, most of them, been defined by the worst things they'd ever done. I remember watching Vorgax, the Kethvari crew leader, watching the screen with complete stillness during the scene where the main character loses someone they've been protecting for most of the film. I remember watching Thresh, the Sorathi, bring one hand up to touch her own face in a gesture I didn't have a framework for, until a human told me later that it looked like someone trying not to cry. I remember Gall, standing at the back of the yard with Torvin beside him, watching not the screen but the inmates, watching us watch it, and something in his expression that I couldn't read at the time but have thought about many times since. At the end, when the film finished and the projection screen went dark, there was silence for about 30 seconds. Then someone, I still don't know who, started making a sound, a low, rhythmic percussion, and someone else joined it, and then more. It took me a moment to realize what was happening. They were applauding, not the way species with hands applaud. Different biological systems express approval differently, but they were doing the equivalent. Every species in that yard was expressing the same thing simultaneously, in their own way. 240 beings who had collectively committed crimes against galactic order, sitting in the cold of a maximum security penal colony, applauding a film made by a species that most of them had been instructed to view as peripheral and unimportant. Masson was standing to the side of the projection equipment. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, to nobody in particular, to himself really, "Yeah, that's the one." After that first official movie night, things changed. Not dramatically, not overnight, not in the ways that make for clean narrative. There was no single moment of transformation, no single gesture that reset the social order and made everything different. Facility 9 was still Facility 9. People still had grievances. There was still violence sometimes. The food was still medically optimized and probably designed by someone who had never eaten. But things changed in the texture of the place, in the way people moved through it. I noticed first that certain long-standing territorial conflicts in the recreation yard began to dissolve is too strong a word. Reconfigure. The Sorathi and the Kethvari had been running a parallel social structure in the yard for 3 years, a careful management of overlapping spatial claims that required constant low-level maintenance and occasionally erupted into something more significant. After movie night, I started seeing Thresh and Vorgax having conversations in the yard. Not formal negotiations, just conversations, sometimes about the films, sometimes about other things. But the territory dispute, which had been a structural feature of the yard for years, stopped being the first thing either of them thought about when they came into the space. Goth noticed it and articulated it better than I could. The films gave them a shared reference point, something they'd both experienced that wasn't a conflict, and the conversations about the films made them into something other than rivals to each other. The guards noticed too. The incident log for the 2 months after movie night began showed a statistically significant reduction in what the administration classified as non-lethal interpersonal conflict events. Gall noted this in his journal. The incident rate has dropped 17% in the 2 months since the screening program formalized. I've been trying to identify the causal factor. There's no new administrative policy that accounts for it. The inmate population and guard ratio haven't changed. The environmental conditions haven't changed. The only variable is the addition of the screening program and the social interactions it produces. I mentioned this to Masson, and he looked at me with that expression he has, the one that suggests he finds something both obvious and slightly disappointing that it needs to be stated, and said, "People who see each other as people are less likely to hurt each other. It's not complicated." I pointed out that it was, in practice, quite complicated. He said, "The insight isn't. The implementation is."